Today's event, on behalf of myself, on behalf of all my colleagues here at the Washington Institute, I want to extend our condolences to the innocent victims of last weekend's horrific terrorist attack by Hamas. The 900 or so Israelis and others from around the world, including what appears to be 11 confirmed Americans, to all of them, to their families, to the people of Israel, to all civilized people around the world outraged by what we have seen, the barbarity of what we have seen this weekend. I extend our deepest condolences. I believe that there's an inflection point that is going on in the Middle East at the moment that is analogous to the inflection point of 9/11. And this will require us to rethink many of the presumptions, the basic paradigm with which we here in the United States, many of us as experts, approached politics, society, and conflict in the region. I'm going to introduce our panelists in just a moment. We have a terrific group today. This is the first of a series of sessions that we'll be doing here at the Washington Institute to analyze, assess, and offer advice to our administration on events in the region. But before I do, I want to take that 9/11 metaphor and expand it. Yes, in terms of certain aspects, intelligence failure, the speed, the scope, the audacity of what we saw of this weekend, yes, the metaphor is apt. But in many ways, I think it's so important to underscore that the 9/11 metaphor, in fact, is not adequate. If you're Israeli, to comprehend the impact and the meaning of what happened this weekend. Let me just offer this handful of reasons, 6 brief reasons why the 9/11 metaphor, in fact, is not adequate. First, the numbers. Proportionately to population, the numbers killed in Israel were 10 times the numbers killed in 9/11. 10 times. Secondly, the intensity. Israel is a small country. You can drive Israel in half a day, compared, of course, to the length and breadth of our great nation. While what happened on 9/11 was the heinous sort of attack, tens of millions of Americans could wake up the next morning without knowing anyone who suffered that day. That's impossible in Israel, where there's not a single Israeli family who can wake up the next day without knowing someone who suffered and or someone who was deployed in the army as a response. Third, if you'll excuse me, sexuality. The element of rape as part of what happened this weekend just underscores the depth of the depravity that we saw. Fourth, terrorists continued to operate on Israeli soil for multiple days, and some, I believe, are still there today, although I think that is about to come to an end. So the length of time of this episode makes it fundamentally different. Fifth, hostages, mass hostages, taken across borders, an element that never before played a role in the 100-year history of this conflict, and an element that is extremely rare in any conflict. I had to go back to the first Chechen war to find examples of large-scale taking of hostages across borders. And then sixth, as we eventually learned in 9/11, that day was the high point of the enemy's action. We all feared that there may have been more, but in the end, there wasn't. And America and its allies went on the offensive from that point on. I think we all recognize, and we're going to talk today and in future days about this, what is going on between Hamas and Israel is potentially the first round of a much larger conflict. And that, of course, could change even more. So the 9/11 metaphor, useful, but limited in its utility. And I think we have to change our mindset to begin to comprehend what this does to the people and the leaders of Israel, and what it does to people around the Middle East looking at how the Israelis are going to respond. In addition to analogies about 9/11, there are many analogies this week to the October War, 1973, exactly 50 years ago. And indeed, from this very table, I hosted an event on the question of strategic surprise, during which none of my fellow panelists, myself included, anticipated what was going to happen just 72 hours later. Yes, the surprise was great. And as in 1973, the Israelis were not deployed properly to be ready for a surprise. But there, that analogy breaks down too. As we know, Sadat launched war to catalyze peace, and the result was Camp David. And 45 years later, Egypt and Israel are still at peace. Hamas did not start this to catalyze peace. Hamas did not start this to create a two-state solution. Hamas did not start this to energize a dormant peace process. In my view, and we'll get into this with all my colleagues just very briefly, Hamas started this for three reasons: to activate a multi-front threat to Israel, second, to fill a vacuum in Palestinian leadership, and third, to stop the march toward regional peace, including the Saudi-Israel agreement, about which there was so much talk in recent weeks. So let me repeat the obvious. Not only are we not seeing just another phase of Gaza, Hamas-Israel conflict that we've seen periodically in recent years, we're seeing something fundamentally different. And we're seeing an Israeli response that will be fundamentally different too. In that, I know the hostage issues play a huge role, but in my view, if I've outlined what I believe Hamas's aims are, here's what I believe Israel's aims will be in the coming period. First, to decapitate Hamas military leadership and to destroy residual military capability. Second, to install confidence among the Israeli people, once again, that the government of Israel and the IDF provides for their security, confidence that has been sorely shaken in recent days. And third, to replace in the minds of regional actors, friends, foes, and would-be friends, the perception of Israeli vulnerability and weakness that was produced over the weekend, and replace it with the idea of Israeli power, dominance, and invincibility. Indeed, I would just not discount the psychological aspect of all this. I think it is critical. All of this augurs for a substantial military effort, one that won't be over soon. Hovering over all this, and what you will hear today and in coming days and weeks here at the Washington Institute, is the threat of wider circles of conflict, an inner circle that includes the Palestinian arena, Jerusalem, West Bank, Israeli Arabs, a second circle of what I'll call near regionals, Hezbollah, Syria, potentially a related security challenge in other places, such as Jordan, if Islamist extremists and Palestinian radicals try to test the regime, a test I believe the Jordanians would win. And then the wider circle, Iran. Let me just conclude these introductory remarks by noting that America has a vital role to play in all of this. What we saw this weekend was not just an Israeli tragedy. It was the most significant act of terror against Americans outside US soil since September 11th. For Hamas, a radical Sunni group, one of the very few rationales for making common ground with the radical Shiite group Hezbollah or the radical Shiite-led regime of Iran, Where do they have common ground? It is their fight against the great Satan and their fight against the lesser Satan. Israel, we should remind everyone, is the lesser Satan. America, Israel's friend, ally, and supporter, has always been the great Satan. We cannot run from that reality. Neither, I should say, can America's Arab friends run from it. They weren't the direct targets of Hamas, but if Israel is weakened, they become more vulnerable. That explains, in my view, the generally lukewarm and equivocal statements that we've seen from Arab capitals. When Israel appears vulnerable, they will look for cover, reestablishing the fact and the image of Israeli strength is in their interest, which makes it in our interest too.